Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us at this opening panel, Dimensions of Environmental Justice in the Midwest. I am Dr. Shannon McMullen, Associate Professor, jointly appointed in the School of Interdisciplinary Studies and the Roof School of Design, Art, and Performance. I am so excited to have joining us today Dr. Elizabeth Grinden Browning, artist Charmaine Charlie Renee, and Dr. Sandra Sydnor. Before we get started, just a little bit of housekeeping. I want to let you know that you should feel free to post questions in the chat box, and I will open Q&A for live Q&A at the end of the session, and we'll have discussion at the end of the session, so I'll save questions for then. If you would keep yourself muted during the presentations as a reminder, that would be fantastic. And there is live closed captioning available for anyone who needs it. I also want to remind everyone that this session is being recorded and will be archived on the Center for the Environment Symposium webpage in the future. And so we will have 3 15-minute presentations going in the order that is listed in the schedule. And so I will do a quick introduction for our first speaker. And this is Dr. Elizabeth Grinden Browning, who is a U.S. historian specializing in environmental history and cultural history in the 19th and 20th century Midwest. She is the Midwestern Indiana Community History Fellow at Indiana University's Environmental Resilience Institute in Bloomington and adjunct faculty in the Department of History. Her forthcoming book, Nature's Laboratory, Urban Environmental Reform, Human Nature, and Social Control in Chicago, 1880 to 1945, examines how Chicago's public intellectuals relied on environmental thought in an effort to stem the tide of labor radicalism. Browning's current research and public history work at the transdisciplinary ERI focuses on histories of environmental health and environmental justice in the Midwest. So with that, I would like to turn it over to Dr. Grinden Browning for her presentation.
Thank you so much, Dr. McMullen, for the introduction. And let's see, I want to share my screen, make sure I can do for joining us today in such a powerful introduction just now by Ms. Latrice Young. So thank you so much. And I want to thank Dr. Laura Zanotti for organizing this panel and inviting me. And I want to thank my fellow panelists who actually had the opportunity to meet earlier this week over Zoom. And we realized that our work really draws on a common theme of resilience, broadly conceived, from our work in climate resilience scholarship to our creative adaptations as scholars during the pandemic, and from our attention to social capital and how our communities practice resilience in the midst of crisis. So I'm really looking forward to exploring those threads in our discussion at the end. As Dr. McMullen mentioned, my research is focused on the history of environmental change and environmental justice in the Midwest. And a lot of that is intellectual history. And I'm particularly interested in how institutions of higher education have engaged with environmental thought since the progressive era, really is what I've been interested in today. What I want to do today is share my lessons that I've gleaned about environmental injustice in Indiana from my work with a team of social scientists on Indiana University's Hoosier Life Survey, which the Environmental Resilience Institute conducted in late 2019 in an effort to understand better how Hoosiers learn about climate issues, how they think about and experience them, what they're doing about it today, and what they'd like to do in the future. The survey, to give you a sense of its scale, it had nearly 3,000 responses, and it represented a cross-section of the state with responses from 90 of Indiana's 92 counties. Much of the survey, of course, is rooted in attention to contemporary climate change opinion, but part of the inspiration for the project came from a very famous social survey conducted in Indiana nearly 100 years ago, the Middletown Survey of Muncie, Indiana. And I'll talk more about the interesting overlaps and divergences between Middletown and our Hoosier Life Survey in a moment. But first, we have to talk about our predecessor, Middletown, a little bit here. So the sociologists and married couple, Robert and Helen Lind, selected the gas boom city of Muncie to become the community that would soon be known simply as Middletown. Commissioned by the Institute of Social and Religious Research and funded by oil magnate John D. Rockefeller, the Lynn's Middletown study became a widely acclaimed examination of shifting patterns of behavior, cultural norms, and community organization in modern America from the 1890s through the 1920s. And they conducted a follow-up study through the Great Depression. While they did not concern themselves explicitly with what we might today call environmental behaviors, the Lynns left a revealing portrait of Hoosier attitudes toward natural resource use, and in so doing, provided a useful template for the much more modest study that the team of ERI social scientists that I'm a part of has conducted over the past few years. So in selecting the gas boom town of Muncie, the Lynns believed that they had found the best, what they called, middle of the road quality location for examining the mundane life of, quote, the common denominator of America, the Middle West. Despite their claim of studying the average American small city, the Lynns distorted the demographic data of Muncie itself, largely neglecting the city's growing African American and ethnic immigrant populations. Having initially selected the larger and more diverse city of South Bend, they settled instead on Muncie out of a desire to make their study feasible and to maintain a focus on social class, uncomplicated by questions of race and ethnic diversity. But clearly, this was a decision that carried a lot of political weight. And as I'll show here, it glossed over patterns of structural racism that would be important for any deep understanding of social dynamics. As you might probably guess from the underlying parameters of the survey in selecting Muncie and avoiding South Bend, the Lynns argued in 1929 that the most important social cleavage in the community was the divide between the working class and the business class. Although by the time of their follow-up publication in 1937, they highlighted racial divides as one of the most salient features of social fracture. But I'm curious about what hints of environmental consciousness or environmental impact we can glean from Middletown's many pages of closely documented social habits. In a period when Indiana's conservation movement was only beginning to gain momentum, the survey is silent on the issue of environmentalism per se. Reading between the lines, however, one finds traces of the environmental concerns that figured into both the Lynns analysis and their subjects' beliefs. For example, consider the White River. The Lynns' discussion of the White River betrayed their otherwise consistent effort to maintain the anonymity of their selected community. The environmentalist Isaac Walton League, the survey declared, quote, aspires to make White River white again. In 1890, when its banks were still forested, the river had been a choice site for picnics, boating, and fishing. But by the late 1920s, it had shrunk to a discolored creek filled with sewage and industrial chemicals. The Lynns condemned Muncie's unspectacular vistas and its dirty patina of industrial pollution as being responsible for depressing residents' desires to spend leisure time in the surrounding natural world. Quote, in this flat land of food crops and murky streams rich with silt, the Lynns concluded, man must find thrills in other things, perhaps in travel, print, radio, or movie. More than anything else, this focus on consumer culture drove the study's analysis and conclusions. Middletown residents, the Lynns emphasized, displayed their economic and social status through the goods that they purchased, such as electric appliances, automobiles, and fresh fruit and vegetables year-round. The shift over the course of less than half a century was striking. Quote, in the quiet county seat of the middle 80s, men lived relatively close to the earth and its products. In less than 4 decades, business class and working class, bosses and bossed, have been caught up by industry, this new trait in the city's culture that is shaping the pattern of the whole of living. Now, left unremarked in Middletown was the impact of this consumer-driven production and consumption upon the environment, including depleted carbon resources, contaminated air and water, trash destined for incinerators and landfills, and more importantly for our purposes today, also unremarked were the socioeconomic and racial stratifications of environmental harms from the industrial system and consumerist culture that took hold in this period. despite their efforts to discuss a homogenous population in their section that they called Group Solidarity, the Linds did point to racial divides and the rise in Muncie of the Ku Klux Klan, which they described took hold in the community, quote, like a tornado. When the Linds began working in Muncie in 1924, the Klan's power over the Republican Party was at its height. And the Klan held large marches in the early 1920s, and in 1924, their march was led by the mayor of Muncie, John Hampton Sr., and the chief of police. On August 7th, 1930, a year after the Linds published their findings, a white mob lynched two young Black men named Thomas Shipp and Abram Smith in Marion, Indiana, less than 40 miles to the north. The next day, a Muncie African-American reverend and mortician, the Reverend John E. Johnson, took the bodies of the murdered young Black men back to Muncie in order to embalm them in preparation for burial. White supremacists planned to form a mob and take the bodies from Johnson, but Black Munsonians rallied and kept a vigil over Reverend Johnson's chapel so that he could complete his work and return the bodies safely to their families in Marion. These very public acts of the Klan's racism and the resistance of Reverend Johnson point to the more subtle divides that shaped the lived experiences of African Americans in the community. Their lack of mobility and opportunity to live in any neighborhood they might choose, or work in any profession, or have access to healthcare or other forms of environmental goods like healthy, uncontaminated environments. So I highlight these points about racial inequality here because they are a reminder of how structural racism both gets baked into everyday lived experiences and how it then goes left unremarked in social commentary and scholarly analysis. And I think this has clearly been changing since the past year's convergence of the disproportionate effects COVID has had on communities of color, along with the pandemic's economic impact. And finally, the Black Lives Matter movement's protests against police brutality. Now, perhaps more than ever in our lifetimes, we have seen the contours of structural racism rise to the surface. But I think it's also important that we as scholars in our contemporary scholarship pay heed to these underlying currents that are key and often unremarked features of our social organization. So now I'd like to turn from Middletown to our contemporary Hoosier Life survey, which I encourage you all to go to our website. There's a wonderful report that you can download and a series of follow-up reports that kind of break down the data in interesting ways. So how are the people in Indiana, today's Middletowns, if you will, thinking about our environment? I'll note here, one of the key divergences between the Middletown study and our Hoosier Life survey was that we deliberately oversampled for members of racial minority groups whose viewpoints might otherwise go underrepresented in a state that includes only 10 counties with a minority population of 15% or greater. So first, some basics. At one level, the survey's results simply confirmed what we see in the newspaper and here on the street, that a significant portion of the Hoosier population remains by and large skeptical of the existence of anthropogenic climate change and leery of efforts to limit human emissions of greenhouse gases. Of the 3/4 of our respondents who believe that the climate is changing, 10%, which is small but a significant fraction, believe that such change is entirely or mostly due to natural and not human causes. And an additional 11% are uncertain what is causing climate change. Hoosier skepticism about the origins of accelerated climate change fits well with their distrust of received expertise, which showed itself in questions about both what is happening in the climate and how to respond to it. A notably large percentage, roughly 4 in 10, disagreed with the statement that, quote, most scientists believe that climate change is happening. And as you can see in this slide, far more respondents reported placing a lot of trust in their own judgment in preparing for extreme weather conditions, such as excess heat or flooding, than they did in that of any other group, including scientists and public officials. And it's interesting to look at the differences depending on which community you're coming from. So this is taking that same data from the previous slide, but breaking it down by region. And you can see that in comparing urban and rural areas, so the top and bottom there, in both areas, 60% of respondents said they trusted their own judgment, But then when you compare trust for national or international scientists, 48% of urban respondents trusted these scientists compared to 27% of rural residents. So there's some interesting things to look at here. So what about respondents' thoughts about how climate change is impacting them? And most important for our purposes today, how did the variables of race and economic status map onto these answers? I'll note here that a majority of Hoosiers think climate change is harming people in the US right now, and 69% believe climate change will hurt people in Indiana. Research shows us that lower income households and communities of color face higher environmental risks from pollution and toxins, and these disproportionate burdens are also felt when it comes to climate change impacts, including extreme weather events such as heat waves and flooding, because these populations don't have the resources to adapt their lifestyles or homes to mitigate these risks. And these factors then snowball into other adverse health effects, including COVID's disproportionate rates among people of color. So perhaps it's not surprising that our survey data showed that lower income Hoosier households are more likely to believe that climate change will harm them personally a great deal compared to higher income households. Okay. And people of color were twice as likely as white people to agree that climate change will harm them a great deal, and significantly more likely to agree that climate change is harming people in the US right now. These signs of higher concern about climate change also extended to questions about whether climate change is happening. 76% of Black Hoosiers and 86% of non-Black Hoosiers of color agree that climate change is happening, compared to 72% of white Hoosiers. And responses about policies to mitigate climate change impacts revealed similar patterns. African Americans are more likely to live in urban heat islands and thus have a more difficult time escaping extreme heat. In the survey, Black respondents were about twice as likely as white respondents to support measures that would reduce heat wave risks, including public funding for air conditioning, health services, and text-based early warning systems during heat events. So I want to conclude with a sense of how Hoosiers are thinking about tackling climate change. Hoosiers tended to believe themselves that they themselves are capable of managing whatever bad things might follow from climate change. And fewer than 1/3 of our respondents agreed with the blanket statement that advances in science and technology will solve almost every problem that humans face. And more than half agreed that the risks of extreme weather could be lessened by simple things we do at home. You can see some of the examples here. It's also interesting to note that nearly half said they would support a statewide income tax increase of up to 1%, with that support increasing incrementally when levying taxes on higher income households and on corporations most responsible for carbon emissions. Despite all these signs of statewide support, we found that only 7% of Hoosiers felt that most of their fellow community members would be likely to support additional tax levies. And half reported that they don't know how their community feels about these taxes. So I think the takeaway here is that the data suggests many in Indiana are not discussing these issues with their neighbors, and thus many are underestimating broader community support for these measures. And a final takeaway that I'll underscore is that any discussion of these issues needs to include addressing racial inequalities and climate change impacts in public planning initiatives. And with that, I will turn it back over to you, Dr. McMullen.
Thank you so much, Dr. Grinden Browning, for this really fascinating presentation that I look forward to hearing more about in the discussion. So at this point, it is my pleasure to introduce Charmaine Charlie Renee, a graduate student in the School for Design, Art, and Performance. Charlie is a Midwestern femme, queer mom, and interdisciplinary artist whose work revolves around the intersection of a queer Midwest identity with a focus on liberation through food justice and radical gardening. In their work, Midwestern mothering and queer domesticity are translated into comfort constructions, quilts, everyday objects, as well as practical collaborations with ACE Food Pantry and Purdue Student Farms. And with that, I would like to turn it over to Charmaine Charlie Renee for their presentation.
Hello. Let me share real quick. All right. All right. Hi. My name is Charmaine, as you heard. You can also call me Charlie. Over the past 2 years, I have worked consistently to resolve my art practice with the needs of those around me. Currently, those needs are focused around queer folk and food deserts. Agriculture and queerness seem incompatible at first glance. At least that's how it felt for me when I moved over 13 times in the 9-year period after finding myself homeless at 19. My garden has become a direct reflection of my stability, mental health, and security. So I've tried to tackle this incompatibility in 2 ways. The first, and more efficient, is to make gardening a daily routine of care and homemaking. The second, and a little bit absurd, is to take the garden and make it mobile. At the beginning of my gardening interest in 2019, I realized that my pantry was low and I was hesitant to go to the grocery store. I still had rent to pay. So for several months, I made art out of old food, dried peels, stains, and I did this partially so I could justify buying fresh produce. Gardens aren't just about food and pretty things, they are political. And unfortunately, this isn't just my story. The 2020 Indianapolis LGBTQ Community Survey report found that more than 1 in 5 queer folks in Indiana struggle to have enough food to eat. Now, this is compared to the 1 in 8 of the general population in Indiana that Feeding America found were hungry. And you can see here that 17% of respondents have experienced homelessness at some point. And in queer circles, it's an often quoted statistic that 40% of homeless youth are LGBTQ. And as we heard from Latrice and Elizabeth earlier, disenfranchised people are the people who bear the brunt of environmental injustice. The Forge-Purdue survey of graduate students released a little bit over a month ago, thank you, Sandra, for sharing that, shows that this is true on our campus. And since the beginning of the pandemic, food insecurity has doubled. Bunyan Bryant, one of the early predominant voices in environmental justice scholarship, defines environmental justice as the cultural norms, values, rules, regulations, behaviors, policies, decisions that support sustainable communities where people can interact with confidence that their environment is safe, nurturing, and productive. Environmental justice is about sustainable communities where people are confident that their environment is safe, nurturing, and productive. So for the queer folk here in Indiana, I ask, is the Midwest that environment? Is it safe, nurturing, productive? There's a very special intersection of queerness and Midwestern identity. Because the Midwest has a more sprawled out population, the concentration of queers is smaller. And asserting an identity that is outside the norm of Midwest family values can be quite isolating. Midwestern queers are largely overlooked. We exist outside of large liberal cities. We are farmers, we are truckers, we are factory workers, and we are part of the Midwestern landscape. So what solutions are there to this absurd problem of hunger? And I say absurd because we live in an agriculture state and yet people are hungry. We attend an ag university, but our students navigate food deserts. It's absurd because there is enough food to feed people, and scarcity is a lie. And so in the tradition of frugal Midwestern mothers, I looked around at what I had and I tried to make something useful. I explored neglected or empty spaces on campus, and I imagined vegetable gardens, cold boxes, any way that I could utilize the space for my needs, much like how queer people build communities and homes. The first physical iteration of these ideas was behind Powell Hall in 2019. I wanted to give students access to fresh veggies with the knowledge of where it came from. It became a little bit of a selfie station for some students. All of the containers were used for the plants were made from plastic, cloth, or found objects. The structure was designed and made by me and my very patient partner, Ashley. We were able to have a community planting party one afternoon, and several Purdue students came to help us plant the veggies. It was wonderful to see the students light up with the knowledge, oh, this is how cucumbers grow. When researching vertical gardens for this project, all of the equipment that I found was expensive, but I knew that this needed to be accessible. I wanted the students to see that you don't need fancy containers to grow food. So, yes, those are strawberries growing out of a urinal, and there is a pepper plant in an iron and sewn target bag. Many of the containers used for this project were made from ironing plastic bags together to use like fabric. The vertical garden was limited to one building on the edge of campus, and I wanted to reach more students, and it happens that most students are on the opposite side of campus. So I kept imagining possibilities with the materials I already had, and these materials expanded to my kitchen table, my car, or anything else that I could MacGyver into a growing space. I regularly imagine growing microgreens on the dashboard of my car and basil in the console. I am always trying to fit things where they don't belong. Again, a not so subtle metaphor for queer families. On the left, we have a kitchen table on wheels with 2 5-gallon buckets for growing tomato plants. And on the right, there are plans for how to grow greens on the roof of my car. I began working with the coordinator of landscape management and design here on campus to move these sketches into reality. Here's a design and model for a mobile garden with a fold-out table, which was to live near the dorms. I really wanted to invite the students to sit and rest and have a chance to wonder. Then COVID-19 hit, and scarcity seemed to be everywhere. Everything that I had been working on relied on and encouraged interaction, community, and some level of intimacy, but these things were no longer safe. So like many during the early days of the pandemic, I threw myself even more into gardening. These were living things that I could nurture and care for without danger. But ideas of community were still very present. I felt a moral obligation to help care for my community, big and small. But I was still figuring out how to do that from a distance and then through my art practice. 2 years ago, there was no thought of coronavirus. When I thought about threats to food security, what seemed the biggest threat, although a little existential, was climate change. I transformed a studio space into an imaginary bunker with a confused time context. There were a lot of items from the 1970s in there. And there, with the reflective mylar on the walls and limited lighting, I grew plants in isolation from the outside world and their natural resources. This displacement served to bring the expectation of future environmental dystopia into the present. 2 years later, I'm completely surprised by the pandemic. My basement looked eerily similar to my previous installation. We entered a different dystopia, and our resilience has been tested. But plants are very resilient, and they are determined to grow. They will grow in many different circumstances, through concrete cracks and out of rain gutters, much to our chagrin. But when they have a healthy community environment, they thrive. Again, not so subtle metaphor for queer communities. So my tactics changed. I worked with ACE Campus Food Pantry to take the gardens to the people instead of asking them to come to my structures. We provided over 80 vegetable plants to Purdue students, faculty, and staff. And you can see here the beginning of those 80+ plants and piecing together an attempt to adapt these materials to current needs. There are egg cartons, Starbucks sample cups, restaurant to-go containers. And I'm very happy that this project has expanded this year to reach more people with Purdue student farms participating. And this kind of community care feels very familiar. We've always carved out our own homes and spaces, and queer folk have adapted our communities to our needs. Finding each other has always been imperative for our survival. And I think a lot about how gardens bring comfort and how the structures and spaces I design invite community interaction. This particular piece from 2020, so pre-COVID, suggests the domestic while confusing the familiarity of the home. While my mobile gardens made space for vegetation, this comfort construction invited reflection and curiosity. What is a home? How is it made? Where does it go? Who is it for? For all of this work, I have followed a strict Midwestern frugality, using what I already have, relying on found objects and neighborly donations of scraps. Often those scraps come from the alleyways. You can see this on the floor of this house structure, the scraps fitting together. I think about sustainability two ways in my work, materially and conceptually. Materially, these projects have end lives. An end plan means that not only do I have closure with the project, but it means that I don't leave anyone with unnecessary work, materials, or trash. And this is considered in the planning of the work. So plants are donated to community gardens, community members, or reused in other projects. Everything is pre-loved and reused as many times as I can imagine. Parts of this structure were made with parts from the vertical garden 3 years ago. Conceptually, sustainable communities are the end goal. Queer families are constructed and must be kept. And my queer family and I like to say that it takes a village to village. And what we mean by that is our community spreads the labor of care according to ability and need. We sustain each other. Thank you very, very much. The culmination of this work is in August with my thesis show. I would love to see you there. Thank you.
Thank you, Charmaine, for sharing your practice, your artistic research, and what is continuing to grow into a very impressive portfolio. I look forward to the exhibition. And now I would like to introduce our final presenter, Sandra Sydnor. Dr. Sydnor is an associate professor and director of diversity and inclusion at the School of Hospitality and Tourism Management here at Purdue University. Dr. Sydnor's investigations of resilient science, regenerative design, climate change, and mindfulness science apply theory and insights to practitioner and classroom settings. Most recently, her interests have led her to assume leadership positions in diversity, equity, inclusion, and racial justice. She is recently Chair Emeritus 2020 of the Tippecanoe County, Indiana Human Relations Commission and currently leads the School of Hospitality and Tourism's Diversity Reckoning as the Director of Diversity and Inclusion in the College of Health and Human Sciences. In this role, Dr. Sydnor collaborates with multiple stakeholders, university, community, businesses, to define, understand, assess, foster, and cultivate diversity. And with that, I would like to turn it over to Dr. Sydnor for her presentation.
Thank you, Shannon, and thank you, Charmaine. That is a tough act to follow. How creative you've been in your thesis project and ways in which you've enabled the community to really sustain themselves in the marginalized ways that we know you've had to do. So thank you so much for that. Okay, well, thank you so much. I am, again, really appreciative of Charmaine's presentation and Lizzie's presentation, and for Dr. Zanotti inviting me to talk here today. And I want to take a little different perspective on what it is that we typically think of when we hear the phrase of environmental justice and how it relates. And Laura, if you don't mind, my rolling ball is stopped. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Well, it just started again. Laura, you're back on. So this notion of environmental justice, I'm new to this conversation, and I'm so happy to be part of this conversation. The ways in which we think about environmental justice and how that includes environmental justice instances in the Midwest, of course, and how it's systemic and it's historic and it's driven by these very same discriminatory and zoning issues and housing discrimination, the habitual practice of concentrating sources of pollution in low-income communities and BIPOC communities, among other unjust policies. And these practices have just exacerbated the risk of extreme weather, which is where I come into the conversation. So I'm a resilience scientist, a researcher, and although I'm a traveler and I'm an outdoor enthusiast woman of color, I'm arriving at this conversation through mapping what we know in resilience science, and specifically resilience to natural disasters, and capturing that in the disaster of environmental justice. So I'll ask you to stick with me here as we go through this thesis. Laura, can we advance to the next slide, please? So environmental justice, the notion of fair treatment and meaningful involvement for everyone, regardless of where they're coming from, regardless of their creed and their nationality and their race, is something that people have lampooned now, begun lampooning, in large part because of where we are as in our consciousness as a nation. So we know that there are markers that can indicate when we'll get there. We know that, for example, when everyone has the same degree of protection from environmental and health hazards, and everyone has equal access to decision-making processes and where we want to live and work, that we will have arrived at some esoteric notion of environmental justice. And yet, at the same time, you know, this COVID crisis has highlighted the interconnection between systemic racism, injustice, and environmental injustice. So people of color, particularly Black people, Latinx, indigenous peoples, are contracting and dying from this virus at far higher rates than our white counterparts. And public health researchers have found that residents that live in these polluted vastways in our country are more likely to experience far more severe effects of COVID-19 than are other people living in communities. So these same communities are also most vulnerable to emergencies and disasters, including those fueled by climate change. And in essence, then we've got this triple pandemic, and this is not the first time you've heard of COVID-19, this new racial awareness and reckoning, and climate change. And it's kind of laid bare the long-standing policies that and practices that create these conditions for poverty and economic instability and concentrations of pollution. So they elevate our risk and they expose us to these deadly threats like environmental racism. Laura, next slide, please. So I'd like to propose a mapping of what we know in resilience science, and particularly resilience to natural and many man-made disasters, to this framework. So our research in resilience to natural disasters suggests that social capital is a major factor in being resilient. And when we see that this social capital, which really can be thought of as a way of a form of the administration of social justice, when we see that being a major factor of resilience in this other context of disasters, and we see the businesses that have higher levels of social capital, and there are two types. There's bridging capital, and bridging capital is capital that is akin to receiving support from your community. And then there's linking capital, and linking capital is akin to receiving support from institutions such as the FEMA or banks giving businesses short-term loans. When we think of those kinds of socialness, so social justice, in that fair and equitable way in which everyone has access to the same rights and privileges, and then social capital, where people are able to leverage these networks that are inoperative because of social justice, we might say, and I'm proposing that we play around with the notion of the same factors that contribute to the disaster of environmental justice might be in some ways mitigated, in some ways remedied by social capital factors, those same factors that we see remedying and mitigating natural disasters and man-made disasters on an environmental scale. So, Laura, next slide. So let's get a little bit more specific and talk about environmental racism in Indiana and in much of the Midwest. Next slide, Laura. So we've got no shortage of examples of environmental racism in the Midwest, and this picture may look very familiar to you. So now Laura is going to be a major star by going to that hyperlink and showing a 2-minute video.
The first time we heard that they were thinking of switching to the Flint River, we laughed. We thought it was a joke. Because there's a ton of cars in there, shopping carts, and we knew that industry had dumped in the river for 100 years and didn't clean it up.
3, 2, 1.
When they actually pushed the button, it was on TV, and we were shocked that we were actually going to be forced to drink from the Flint River.
Here's the Flint. Here.
About a month later, people were complaining about orange and brown water. You would watch the news and they would say, well, river water is a little bit harder to treat than lake water, and we've got it under control. It's just a bump in the road.
When I really recognized that Flint has switched is one early morning that I heard on Channel 12 News that General Motors had begun to switch from the Flint River water back onto Detroit water because it was corroding their products.
Flint City officials insist Flint River water is good enough to drink, but it's been causing problems with issues at General Motors.
And I just knew, common sense told me that if it's messing up their automotive parts, it has to be a problem for consumption. So that's when I got up and got mobilized and got engaged to find out what was going on with this water. This church was where we spearheaded a group called the Coalition for Clean Water, bringing together other community groups that was out working to fight this water crisis.
NRDC started to understand the magnitude of the crisis in Flint back in the summer of 2015. ACLU of Michigan started to suspect that there may be potential litigation related to the environmental issues, the safety of the drinking water. They reached out to NRDC because they knew that we have expertise and a deep knowledge of safe drinking water laws and how to bring these types of environmental citizen suits.
Pediatricians know lead. We know what lead can do. Every agency tells us, from the CDC to the American Academy of Pediatrics, that there's no safe level of lead. When I heard of the possibility that there was lead in the water, it was a call to action. We decided to look at the lead levels just in our clinic. So the Hurley Children's Clinic sees the most Flint kids. And we compared lead levels before the water switch to lead levels after the water switch. And we did see this increase in the percentage of children with elevated lead levels. And we were absolutely heartbroken. We had to share this information as soon as possible. So we decided to hold a press conference.
This research is concerning. These results are concerning.
To alert our families to stop using this water, to use bottled water, to use filters, and hopefully to be able to get the water source changed back to Detroit. Right after we shared this information, my science was dismissed, the research was dismissed, and the state came out publicly stating that I was wrong, that I was causing near hysteria. So I shouldn't have been surprised, because for 18 months, the heroic people of Flint had been dismissed. The moms, the activists, the pastors, the journalists, the scientists.
Thank you, Laura. So, vulnerable populations, including minoritized populations, live in areas such as Flint, Michigan, that place them at this higher risk of exposure to social and environmental hazard. And I was born and raised in Muskegon, Michigan, which is on the west coast of Lake Michigan. And Flint easily became one of the poster children for environmental racism, and probably was one of the bellwether incidents to really wake people of color up that this was something that was happening across the state and then across the country. So the ways after officials repeatedly, including the governor of Michigan, repeatedly dismissed claims that Flint's water was making people sick, residents that had never been involved in any kind of organized, formal, active protest began protesting and organizing themselves. And the ways in which their social justice manifested might have easily been through the social capital networks that they'd established, and probably saved at least one generation from an early mortality. Laura, can we advance to the next slide, please? So there is so the government collects and has begun collecting a lot more data on the things that make us all vulnerable. One of those data and one of those metrics that we use in our resilience to natural disasters that often become man-made disasters is the Social Vulnerability Index, SOVI. And it measures the vulnerability of people that live in U.S. counties to environmental hazards that may then progress, like we see in environmental injustices, may progress to human hazards. And we can see that the higher the score, so the measurement index is in the bottom right-hand corner, the scale, and wherever you see red, you see the highest of social vulnerability scores. And this index is an index of around 29 variables that make a county more vulnerable to hazards. One of those measures and one of those variables is race. So it will come as no surprise that counties that have higher incidence of minoritized populations and poorer populations are those that are most vulnerable. So as we look at sections of the Midwest here on this map, you'll see that the areas in red include much of northern Michigan, probably accounting for a lower socioeconomic area there. We also see that Detroit, Michigan, Cleveland, Ohio, St. Louis, Missouri, the Gary, Indiana corridor and parts of Chicago also have very, very high social vulnerability indexes. And it just puts a highlighted score on what we find in the Midwest vis-a-vis our neighbors. Next slide, please, Laura. So there's also data, and we're not going to go to this hyperlink in the interest of time, but there is also data that is comprised that ask us to consider the risk of potential for negative impacts when we meet environmental hazards. And this risk actually has an environmental justice component built in. But that component, that risk equation, is a combination of an expected annual loss, which is a natural hazards component. So like if we are expecting the natural hazard of a flood, then this equation factors in, based on that county level data, a expected loss from that flood. And that's, of course, compiled on a number of different indices. But the equation considers that, and then it multiplies that times a county's social vulnerability. So that's called a consequence enhancing component. So that means the higher you are, the higher you score in that social vulnerability index, the more likely it is that you're going to experience catastrophic negative effects. And then that's divided by a community and a county's community resilience. So that is considered a consequence reduction component. The higher your level of community resilience, which, as it happens to be, is a function of the social capital in that community, the less likely you are to be negatively impacted by this national risk index that scientists have developed to kind of pre-order and predict who's going to experience the most vulnerability. Laura, if we can go to the next slide, which I believe is our last slide. Yes. So what I'm proposing is that we decrease our vulnerability by adopting an anti-racist training, perspective, and behavior. And as we develop with these anti-racism attitudes and perspectives, it first increases social capital. It allows for our diversity to be amplified, not only in race and ethnicity, but also economically. It increases the likelihood that environmental justice can be addressed and redressed by environmental restoration, and therefore all of those contribute to decreasing environmental racism, things like unenforced codes and water treatment facilities being placed in BIPOC communities. So Laura, thank you. Thank you all for being here and for listening and participating. And Shannon, back to you.